everyone. Thanks for joining us for part two of this quick hit with Christopher Balding and Albert Marco talking about the U.S.-China decoupling. What we've covered in the first part really is a lot on U.S. foreign policy, looking at Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. We looked at U.S.-China trade and a number of other aspects around the U.S.-China relationship. Going into the second part of this, we'll be looking at the Belt and Road Initiative and kind of the answer that the U.S. may have to the Belt and Road Initiative, and if that's necessary, as well as corporate activities. Are the U.S. and China targeting corporates? How does that work? And how would that play within the environment of decoupling? So thanks again for watching this. Please subscribe to our newsletter, which you can find below. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel, which you can find below as well. As always, we appreciate it and enjoy. Now let's move along a little bit more into economics, I guess, and talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is something that I actually worked on for about 1.5 years. So there's been some talk, I guess, in particular the last few months about the Anglosphere, and does will the West have an answer to the BRI? And this is really a 8-year-old question, I guess. But I guess my first question is, does the U.S. need a response to the BRI as a government initiative? And if so, do you think they can do it? And that question is from at SW33T Yams. So thanks for sending that in.
Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, so I was just going to say, look, if, just as rappers get shown to the VIP room, if you're a country and you are offering goodies, you're going to get shown to the VIP room in whatever country you go to. Okay. That doesn't mean it has to be, the Trump and Hare initiative or whatever we want to call it. I do think, we do need to think about, and we should absolutely put effort into how can the U.S. provide positive things to countries. Okay. One of the things, would be my advice. If the Trump administration, which I think a lot of people are finally seeing the value, especially in the tech sector, why don't we set up an office that says, I have a company in China that, makes XYZ product and they want to move out of China. We have a database of where to go. Okay. And, I know bankers in Vietnam that were like, hey, we're just getting slammed, so why doesn't the U.S. have an office of, infrastructure for emerging markets like Vietnam to help get Chinese, migrating Chinese companies? Those types of goodies, even in a lot of different forms it could take, are going to open a lot more doors than just saying that it's the right thing to do.
Right. That's good.
Yeah, I agree. But it's also gonna need a little bit of help from our partners, specifically Australia, the UK, plus Japan. Basically, Five Eyes plus Japan, right? So we're gonna need a little bit of help from our partners to enact such a thing. It's gonna need shared costs. Supply chains have to move. It's gonna take a little while. So we should do more, but it's gonna take a little bit of effort from everybody.
Right. So it's basically a government kind of somewhat directed, but not necessarily directly involved. So it seems like what you're saying is Americans will take a little easier hand than the Chinese kind of very direct hand in say these multilateral or multi-country activiis. Is that fair to say?
I'll give you one example I was told about, and I this is something I'm surprised hasn't gotten more attention. The Commerce Department apparently has a tariff waiver program where if you say, look, we have this plant, it's in China, it's facing tariffs. Here's our 180-day plan to move our production to Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Africa, wherever. The Commerce Department will give you a waiver for, whatever time period. If you give them a plan, we're moving stuff there. Okay. Right. So that's the kind of stuff that should be more publicized. And, the U.S. government is taking an active role to kind of partner with business to say, you take the lead. And if you're doing it, we'll help you.
Great. So let me throw you the next question, Albert. This is from at Alice_Greenwood. How long will it take the U.S. to decouple from China? So if we assume what Chris just talked about with some of the, say, Commerce Department activities, other things, does the U.S. really want to decouple from China fully? And if so, how long will it take to get either to that level or to say a desired level that U.S. companies would want to?
Well, a desired level is the right term. I mean, we're not going to fully decouple from China. That's just that's just absurd. When they're talking about moving supply chains, I've heard all sorts of 15, 20 years to 1 year, and it actually depends on each sector. It's a lot easier to move a software gaming company rather than a pharmaceutical manufacturing company. So it's going to, depending on the sector, it could take anywhere from 1 year to 10 to 15 years.
What do you think about that, Chris?
I think that's generally accurate, and I think one of the things is like a lot of the like stuff that China was known for over the years, like let's say low wage manufacturing, assembly, that type of stuff. I mean, Apple set up a plant in India which can make iPhones in about 18 months. Okay, and I think as Albert pointed out, it's not people think of decoupling as there's not going to be trade between the U.S. and China. I think what you're really seeing is this move to, let's say, bipolar, supply chain worlds, especially in tech. Okay, so there's going to be like a China-specific manufacturing world for tech stuff and a non-China, because you can already see the U.S. government and other governments and even companies saying, "Hey, our your tech is not has not been touched by China."
Right. Which, frankly, I believe that's what China's wanted all along, is their own Chinese ecosystem and then a rest of world ecosystem, so they can control that technology and the messaging over that technology. That's what they had 20 years ago. And there's been kind of things overlapping for the last, say, 10 years. And I believe that deep down, they really want a separation of those things. Okay, let me ask you this. Candide, so this is at Candide XXI. What will be the political and economic pressures outcomes produced by the ending of Chinese investment and the debt expansionary cycle? Which is an interesting question, but I think, maybe go into one or two things, but, I guess underlying that question is that expected to happen? I mean, I think a lot of people have this question on their brain, but I don't necessarily see that happening, let's say, in the next 3 to 5 years. I mean, these things tend to go a lot longer than many people assume.
So, the way to phrase this is, let's assume that China went to 0% debt growth right now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean, honestly, China would be in flames by the end of the day. I mean, it would explode. There's no other way to put it. I mean, that can't happen. I mean, that simply can't happen. I mean, she would be lynched by the end of the day. I think the number that I saw, and it's a staggering number, is debt to GDP in China this year is, I think, going to increase by like upwards of 30%. So it's going to go from like upwards of say 300% to upwards of like 330% in 1 year. Okay, I mean that's a staggering number. I don't see, they're going to keep this going as long as possible. For them to get this under control is going to be at least a 10, 20-year cycle at best. And in all likelihood, they're headed for North Korean financial system with Japanese debt. I mean, that's the only logical outcome, because if they were to, for instance, open up the capital markets, the RMB would drop, 50% easy. I mean, no question.
So what you're saying is there's a possibility that CNY could be a global currency.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay, Albert, what do you?
Yeah, I agree with Chris here. China's well within the euro-dollar system. They need dollars. They can't get away from dollars. They need it for their debt. they multiply it out to issue more renminbis out to the emerging markets. They're not leaving, and they're not getting out of the system for any time soon.
Okay, great. So let's take it more into kind of the corporate realm as well. When we look at like Huawei and TikTok and some of the Chinese companies that have a large international presence, given the dynamics at home, if the U.S. continues to cut off these companies and some of their crucial activities overseas, how does that bend back onto China? How dire is it? Is it not a big deal, or is it pretty dire? Not just in terms of acquiring technology, but in terms of actually making money and keeping the home markets floating.
Oh, that's the name of the game, is making money for them. They need dollars. They need dollars from overseas desperately. Without that, their entire financial system implodes. I mean, they go out into Africa, and then they loan out renminbi, and they expect money paid back in dollars at all times. Mm-hmm. So without the dollar, they're just they're buying time.
Okay. I think on the corporate side, what I would add is, especially in the tech sector, and this doesn't apply to this. I should say, I don't think this applies as much to like the SOE type of coal sector, for lack of a better example. But especially in the tech sector, these are guys that, maybe have been abroad for a fair amount of time. They want to emulate the Googles, they want to be international. They think of themselves as cosmopolitan, even if they grew up in the system. And so even though they might be, pro-China, which is different than like pro-CCP, they want to be a part of that global tech scene. Okay. And so to have those limitations on them, I think is a constraint that they don't necessarily like. Okay. But that's the reality of the system that they find themselves in.
So will they change their behaviors to align with the constraints outlined by the US, or will they remain true to what the CCP tells them to do and their business will suffer internationally?
Europeans, US, they're absolutely
Mexico, the reason why there's war, which is
business will suffer internationally because the reality is as a Chinese business, you can't get away from that. I mean, as soon as Jack Ma says I'm going to obey the SEC and file this type of audit, they get blown up in China.
Okay, and then
I agree.
Go ahead, Albert. Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, they can walk a tightrope until they absolutely get pressured by the Chinese government, and then they have to fall in line. There's no other choice for them.
Okay, so Albert, you mentioned IPOs earlier. So we've seen more IPOs in the 4 years of Trump, more Chinese IPOs in the 4 years of Trump than we saw under the 8 years of Obama. Okay. So do you see that pace? First of all, why is that? Are they just trying to cash in and get dollars into their companies, or is there some other reason? And I guess the second question, is that pace possible? Is it possible to continue that pace?
I think they're just taking advantage of the market and being able to cash in and cash out as fast as they possibly can. Do I think it's sustainable? Absolutely not. I mean, I think this market's overbought, and eventually there'll be a correction. And on top of that, I think that the U.S. government needs to have some reasonable accounting standards for Chinese companies that refuse to open their books for transparency. It boggles my mind. At this point, why shouldn't I just go to China, buy a company, and list it on the NASDAQ for some absurd amount of money? There's nothing saying that I need to open my books. It's absolutely crazy.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And this is one of the most frustrating arguments by the China apologists, because I'm like, when you make the same argument that Google, Goldman, whoever is not subject to the SEC or U.S. jurisdiction on U.S. financial markets, you make that argument, then I will entertain your argument about Chinese companies. Until then, it's nonsensical.
Okay, so let me just kind of sum this up. So China is the biggest U.S. foreign policy issue. China has they're in an untenable position of having their companies locked down, or some of their companies locked down by the U.S. They have a shortage of dollars. They have unsustainable debt. And if the current U.S. policies continue, at least Albert thinks that Chinese leadership is in peril, right? So what glass half full view am I not seeing?
So I will say one of the things that I would say is, and look, you can see this. This is in a way very predictable in the sense that I'm sure that they have, like, any company inside the government. They basically say this is our target for what we need to hit at the current account surplus for next year. Okay. Mm-hmm. They sit down in November, December, and they say, okay, this is our target for 2021, whatever it is. Because you can see that those numbers are almost so stunningly predictable. Okay. Mm-hmm. And what's amazing is they have a very good idea of what their leakages are going to be. Okay. That money that gets, leaked out in Macau gaming chips or, yep, Bitcoin and all that other good stuff. They know what they have to hit. Okay. Right. And the thing is that I think my favorite thing of all this that people, for some reason, almost nobody knows about is that they're already rationing US dollars. Okay. Most banks in China have the 1-to-1 rule that, yep, you have to bring in $1 to send out $1. Okay. Right. And so they have that number. And as long as they can continue to balance those books through, it came out, I think, just a day or two ago that they're no longer buying Australian iron ore. Okay. Like, as long as they can continue to juggle those books, it can keep up for a while.
So they're the free trader with heavily managed trade. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Oh, I wouldn't even call it free trade. I would just say heavily managed trade.
Free trade in scare quotes, right? I mean, so Albert, what glass half full rosy view am I missing on China?
Well, I'm at a loss for words almost on that one. I mean, for the Chinese, you would hope that they understand how bipolar systems work, and understanding the Apple versus Microsoft component as like, let the one guy be big and you fill in the gaps and everybody be copacetic. I don't know if I can buy that for very long, but right. That's my only hope is Xi, if Trump is elected, which I am speculating that he is, comes to this realization and says, let's tone down the pressure. Let's fulfill the phase 1 deal, phase 2 deal, whatever they want to go into, make inroads and just ratchet down the tensions. Okay,
great. Last question, guys. Albert, I know you've done a lot of forecasting for the presidential election, so let's talk about that for a minute. And I know this is the first presidential election I will have been in the U.S. since George W. Bush's first election. So it's been a long time. So it's been a circus freak show for me to be here watching, right? And I suspect it's the same for Chris as well. So talk to us a little bit about your view on the election. Like, what do you think is going to happen? And I guess why? And if we can abbreviate that, there's a lot of election analysis out there, but you have some really interesting views, and I'd love to hear why. And Chris, also, as he's talking, it's your first time to be back here. What are some of your observations and expectations as well?
Well, so I know we are seeing all sorts of polling numbers that are just eye-popping, and just I cannot believe publishers actually put this out to print. 15 points for Biden, 11 points for Biden.
Right before I jumped on this, sorry to interrupt you, Albert. I actually, just before I saw this, I saw a poll saying Biden up 17.
It boggles my mind how these people just either they miss statistics class or just don't know how to add. But for Biden to be up 17 points, you would have to assume the Democrats come out in some kind of record 80% turnout, and on top of that, have the Republicans, 15% of them, either not show up or vote for Biden.
But even Reagan's 84 blowout wasn't a 17 point win, was it?
No, this
I mean,
is what's boggling to me. I just I
right.
don't understand it. I go through, a couple states because this is an electoral college. We know what California is going to
Yep.
do. We know what New York's going to do. We just toss those aside. If you look at Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona, those are the states that you really have to look at. And almost in every single state, the Republicans have gained hundreds of thousands of new registrations, right? And even in the polling that's done out there, there's a few pieces of data that are you can actually look at and understand and apply to what's going on. Is 96 or 94% of Republicans have an approval of Donald Trump.
Right.
How do you get to 17 point lead when 94% of Republicans support Donald Trump? That's unbelievable to me.
Right.
And you have these the Economist has been my favorite lately, of the 99.9% victory for Joe Biden over Donald Trump. It's just these are just silly numbers people throw out there because they're believing what polls have to say that are coming out of lockdowns.
Yep.
Right. They're doing 100% phone polling, so they have no opportunity to go out into the public and see who they're talking to. And study after study has shown that Republican voters have been not just shy vote. I don't like to even use the word shy anymore, but actually spiteful of the pollsters and purposely saying that they're going to vote for Biden. That's how you get to these 17-point numbers.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Chris, what are you seeing?
I think I'll be honest. I haven't. I'm actually in a way like, yes, I have views, but I try to stay away from politics, as much as possible, especially on like China and stuff like that, because whether it is Trump or Biden, I see what we're in with China as a 20 to 40 year type of challenge. So at some point there's going to be Republicans. At some point there's going to be Democrats. Just from a social perspective, and Tony, I think you can identify with this. Man, America's crazy. Okay, I mean,
democracy is messy, right?
And I think the thing that just amazes me is, I'll be honest, I'm a live and let live kind of guy. So if you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, if you're a Green or a Libertarian, I don't really care. We can still sit down and smoke a cigar. And I think the thing that just amazes me is America just seems angry. And it seemed really angry for some time. And I think the thing is it's really like incumbent upon all of us to say, look, we can all talk about Trump, but we can, both parties can point to things that the others have done that is unethical, that is abnormal. I mean, all this kind of stuff. And I think it's one of the things, like when we talk about rejuvenating American democracy, it gets back to, we need to be better citizens to each other. We need to accept losses, that, it's not going to be our time all the time. And the way I always like to think of it is, I think what has been termed the political golden rule, it's like, don't advocate a policy that you don't want used against you.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Chris, I attribute the hate, that we're seeing now and the polarization squarely on the weaponization of social media. Completely right there. Because we can sit there and put out a viral post of someone a phrase taken out of context and making that person look like just a demonic figure, and then dox the guy, show him his address, and have 15 people show up at the house with pitchforks and torches. It's just insane, Right. And there's got to be some kind of accountability on social media by either the government or social media standards themselves, that they need to cut this down a little bit, because it's over the top at this moment.
Social media doesn't have standards, Albert, because I know you're both active on social media.
That's true. This is true.
The way I always think about it is a country or a political party is like a family barbecue. I mean, we've all gone to those family barbecues and go, who are these losers that are at this family barbecue? Okay. And if you aren't going to your own political party or your own country and going, dang, these are some losers I'm hanging out with. Okay. Right. I mean, you're doing it all wrong.
Right. Exactly. No, I agree with that. And on that optimistic note, guys, I think we're going to close it out. You've been so generous with your time. Thank you so much. Chris Balding, Albert Marco, you guys are great. And I can't wait to see the reaction to these comments. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks, guys.
Appreciate it, Tony.